Cyberpunk 2077 was the worst game ever made, until it wasn't. No Man's Sky was a good idea, wasted on horrible execution, until it wasn't. These games were developed completely independently of each other in different time frames, but they both carry important lessons about game development. And yet the circumstances under which both of these games failed and then picked themselves back up are so different that it's still worth contrasting. How does a game studio with funding from the federal government handle their mistake versus an indie studio with maybe 12 people? This is the story of how the greatest comeback in gaming history happened. It's a tale as old as gaming. A studio has a big idea and tons of promises, with a development history going back a decade before it even hits shelves, but when it finally gets in the public's hands, it's shown to be half-baked and unready to go to market. At this point, it's unclear to the average person whether a good house can be constructed from this failed product launch, because gamers can't get a good sense of the house the devs were trying to build in the first place. Cyberpunk in particular has a distinct place in gaming history for its devs at CD Projekt Red, being one of few cases where the company came right out and said, "We're sorry." This story has a good ending though. Eventually, Cyberpunk 2077 would go on to be one of the most critically acclaimed video games ever made. So what the heck happened? Why didn't the devs just wait until it was ready to launch? The answer is, oh God. I mean, do I even need to spell it out for you? Look, Chum, I'm not gonna sit here and say something nobody's ever said before. Corpo bad, want money, wake up samurai. Don't develop product and rush it outdoor to meet deadline. Probably not good. Not rocket science. CD Projekt Red put themselves in a bad position. But the only reason CD Projekt Red put themselves in that bad position is because they had the resume to put themselves in that bad position. That resume starts with what everybody knows as the Witcher series. The Witcher rightfully gave CD Projekt Red something to be proud of and maybe even a little bit arrogant about. The Witcher and the Witcher video games are something of a cultural staple for Poland. In 2011, the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk even gave a copy of The Witcher 2 to President Obama as a gift. The thing is, you could have predicted Cyberpunk's implosion, especially if you had played those original Witcher games. The first Witcher game, when it came out in 2007, had a lot of bugs and performance problems. Some employees who worked on the game reported that loading screens could last up to 5 minutes. This company had a culture of do it yourself when it came to software, and they didn't outsource a lot of software. A lot of the time, their in-house solution was just worse than other industry alternatives. The build-it-as-you-go approach of game design carried over from The Witcher to The Witcher 2 Assassins of Kings and to The Witcher 3 The Wild Hunt, but they weren't so bad that it tarnished the overall view consumers had of the product. It was treated more like video game jank, kind of like Bethesda's Elder Scrolls games, and more or less accepted with the territory. A decade later, CD Projekt Red was riding a high and ascending to a prestigious circle, and they were ready to make the next big step. Cyberpunk 2077's seeds were planted as far back as 2012 when they approached the father of Cyberpunk itself, Mike Pondsmith. This was an easy sell. The Witcher games were standout hits in an era that was pivoting to live service multiplayer, proving that there was still a market for earnest, artful story-based games and that CD Projekt Red could make them, and they knew what they were doing. To make the sell even easier, the Witcher series had proven that the Polish game studio was familiar with taking pre-existing licenses and adapting them into immersive, exciting video game worlds. After all, the Witcher trilogy was adapted from the famous books of the same name, written by Polish author Andrzej Sapkowski. Pondsmith was impressed by how knowledgeable the CD Projekt devs were about his baby, and so he reached an agreement to license the universe's fictional timeline from its in-universe point of 2077 and onwards for storytelling purposes, bringing him on as a consultant on the game's design to ensure it remained cohesive with the world building and the lore. Even better yet, CD Projekt Red was putting their foot forward with some heavy-hitting technology. The brand new Red Engine 4, the newest version of their internal proprietary game engine, with an eclectic mix of bells and whistles, a double texture system, streamed colors, and something called polygon triangulation, which I don't know what that is, but it sounds cool. In fact, Red Engine 4 was so awesome that the Polish government gave CD Projekt Red a $7 million grant for the purpose of developing it. Cyberpunk's team members were feeling themselves by 2018 after 2 years of dedicated work. They were working with A-list superstars like Keanu Reeves and Run the Jewels, just to name a few, and the game cleared at promotional and marketing events. Best Game at E3, People's Choice at IGN, Game of the Show at Game Informer, on and on. They brought along Keanu to promote the game as one of its lead stars when E3 was still around, and at E3 2019 announced an initial release date of April 16th, 2020. Then COVID happened. So now they had to release a game in the middle of a pandemic, so the game got delayed to September. Then it got delayed to November. And finally it got delayed to December. There was just one problem with that. Not that some problems weren't obvious by now. Devs at CD Projekt Red sometimes would only hear about those delays on Twitter first, which is a detail we'll come back to. Now, we all know what happened when the game actually came out. People know it was bad, but I don't think people know how bad. It was more than just janky. The game was just unplayable. Refund demands crashed Sony's customer service website. Sony and Microsoft offered full refunds, and Sony themselves even pulled the title off their online store. A budget upwards of $436 million for the most publicly embarrassing release in video game history. And it cost 3 times as much as a movie ticket. After a decade of hype, CD Projekt Red was facing the music. About 6 months later, an anonymous employee at CD Projekt Red presented an unflattering account of the company's work culture. And the brand spanking new version of Red Engine, the one they got that check from the government for, apparently, that wasn't ready for Cyberpunk 2077. According to Game Rant, one developer described it as, quote, driving a train while the track was still under construction. A phenomenon we still see talked about in the dev industry to this day. COVID certainly didn't help, but maybe it was just a convenient excuse for some mistakes the company wasn't willing to admit. So not only was the game unplayable, it was unplayable for the wrong reasons. Not that there are any good reasons for such a thing to take place, but the context CD Projekt Red sat in was really bad. They definitely seemed, in some ways, like the bad guys, which would dismay many gamers at the time from the great reputation they'd previously established with the Witcher series. With an article published in December of 2020, the New York Times took a deep dive into what work inside the building was like, and the picture they painted was not flattering. Devs were concerned with overpromising on a check they couldn't cash. Rumors had spread in social circles that the game was way behind schedule, and more negative morale spread with the departure of people high up in the chain of command. CD Projekt Red also kept a tight lid on press coverage of the game that certainly would have eliminated the bugs and performance issues well before release, particularly for the console versions of the game. Performance issues that were felt even worse by the previous gen Xbox One and PS4. The situation was unacceptable by every metric, and people around the scene of the disaster were blamed, even by Sony executives. CD Projekt Red even got to a point where they explained that they would pay for refunds out of their own cash. It wasn't enough to get the company off of the hot seat, though, with not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 class action lawsuits built up into one common action. Settling out of American court cost the company $1.85 million US. And at one point, it came out that the company had mandated months-long 6-day workweek crunch periods after Poland's Office of Competition and Consumer Protection investigated the company in 2021. There were a lot of things going on here that shouldn't have been happening. It's also come out that the company had tied developer bonuses to review scores. To that end, they changed their mind on that for reasons that I'm sure were unrelated to being investigated by the federal government and paid out the full bonus anyway. Around the same time that they were being investigated by the federal government, co-founder at CD Projekt Red, Marcin Nowinski, formally apologized in a 5-minute long video uploaded to YouTube. But there was something very distinct about his apology that was different than any game studio had given before. Nowinski had made a proactive, deliberate effort to shift the ire of fans onto himself. He said it was his decision to push the game to the point that it was at. Now, did that make up for the crunch day work schedule, the work culture, and other things disgruntled employees had complained about? I think that's up to you. Regardless of moral status, and regardless of whatever shady company practices they had adopted in the past, CD Projekt Red owned their ish. To that end, they published a roadmap with stated amount of patches and timeframes. A cyber attack on the devs didn't help, of course, but here's how it went. Patch 1.2 in March 2021, hundreds of bug fixes. Patch 1.3 in August, code cleanup. A lot of people were mad it wasn't content, but the devs kept hustling. The big ticket was 1.5 in February of 2022. More clothing options, balanced economy, improved combat, and of course needed bug fixes. But This had actual hard game stuff, not just backend. Still, 2 years is a long freaking time to wait for a game to get fixed, especially when you already paid $60 up front. About 8 months later comes the hit Netflix show Cyberpunk Edgerunners, and the redemption arc for CD Projekt Red's Cyberpunk was complete. 1 year later, an expansion pack in the form of Cyberpunk Phantom Liberty releases to seal the deal and cement Cyberpunk's status as a truly generational pop culture staple, and a tremendous artistic achievement 3 years after that initial catastrophe in 2020. And it's a good reputation that I think the game deserves, but I also think a lot of people were really rooting on Cyberpunk in the first place, because most people could recognize that there was effort in the bones of Cyberpunk. Most people understood that the game was not badly designed, as bad as a blueprint can be anyway. It was simply an unfinished house, and should not have been listed, to make a metaphor, as early as it was. So the moral of the story is, if you're a big dev studio with backing from the Polish government, and the capital to pull A-list celebrities like Keanu Reeves, and the guys from Run the Jewels into your creative process, you can release a game before it's finished, and finish it 2 years later. That may sound facetious, and it's not exactly my intention, but that is a reality of the dynamic that a lot of people, I think, overlook. Nevertheless, Cyberpunk 2077's comeback is often cited in league with another game that managed to do a similar sort of reputation 180, but they didn't have nearly the same kind of budget the CD Projekt Red had. This studio was much smaller, and they were going from Joe Danger to a procedurally generated space exploration game. Now, we have a similar tale of tragic failure to meet expectations, followed by a redemption arc here at Hello Games and No Man's Sky. But CD Projekt Red had something that Hello Games did not have: capital. CD Projekt, as we stated before, was not dealing with small potatoes. They had caught the attention of literal world leaders and were cemented in the pop culture space. Hello Games were humble indie game devs trying to deliver promises of one of the most expansive, involved, and detailed exploration games ever made. Rich, exotic worlds with never-before-seen alien creatures, space dinosaurs. Go to space, go to different planets, do spaceship, kablam, pow, boom, space dinosaurs. You have me at space dinosaurs. Now, this was a trailer, and of course, the first gameplay trailer you get very often isn't going to reveal too much about the final product. God knows that smart consumers aren't going to judge the game until it's in their hands these days, but this was 2014. There were certain levels of trust that gamers still had. Game companies were just kind of taken at their word. If the trailer showed off these graphics, then it better have these graphics when it comes out, or you're gonna get flamed hard like Watch Dogs. But the gimmick here didn't seem that unobtainable, because No Man's Sky was using an interesting development technology here. Hello Games took a cue from Minecraft and was making usage of procedural generation. Basically, instead of hard coding a bunch of gaming environments, the game would use a system of predetermined variables from which a wide variety of game worlds could spawn. This made development resources a lot easier to consolidate and allowed a smaller studio like Hello Games to create a rich, vibrant play space without a ton of labor. There's just one problem. If you don't populate the randomized spaces with actual design, with actual mechanics and things to do, you haven't made a video game. You've made a random number generator. Nevertheless, a lot of people were willing to take a chance on Hello Games. Getting misled by a big company like Ubisoft was one thing, but getting misled by an indie dev? That could never happen, right? When No Man's Sky finally released, some people went out of their way to write bullet lists, point by point, with receipts of how many things had been promised, just to not end up in the final game. You can look up a list compiled by Internet Historian that details them in painstaking detail. Just to name a few things, No Man's Sky, although it promised as such, did not include large-scale open-world battles like the one you saw in the trailer, roaming ships, planets with vastly different resources, independent maneuvering of your starship, or even butterflies. The kicker here, of course, is all of those things that I listed did eventually get added. But of course, we have to talk about what the backlash was like before this happened. Basically, to the dismay of the company's chief executive, Sean Murray, No Man's Sky would launch with upwards of 400,000 concurrent players, much more than the 10,000 or so they expected. This, of course, led to all sorts of support problems with bugs and crashes that the team couldn't keep up with fast enough. Reviews started rolling in describing the game as unfinished with a severe lack of content and actual things to do. Not to mention, half of what was promised in the marketing material was never a part of the base gameplay experience. Not to mention, it was marketed as a full-priced game at $60. To top it off, Sean Murray and pretty much every avenue of communication from Hello Games had been radio silent for 2 months after the game's release. A lot of people felt duped and demanded refunds. Sony president at the time, Shuhei Yoshida, noted that Hello Games' PR skills were not Great. So Sean Murray and his team were in a rough situation without half of the resources other big companies had. Morale inside the building was low as the team became the subject of bomb threats, prompting a consistent communication with Scotland Yard. A few months after the game had released in August, the radio silence proved to be for a productive reason. In November of 2016, Hello Games released the Foundation update, which consisted of content. They added base building, freighters that you could spawn in from anywhere and carry tons of stuff you picked up on the planet. There were the bones of an actual resource management system here with tasks and decisions that carried a certain degree of weight. Then the Pathfinder update added vehicles, which obviously made traversing planet surfaces easier. A year later comes Atlas Rises, a story-based mode that fleshed out the game to a solid portion with 30+ hours of single-player content, as well as portals, more procedurally generated content, trade, economy stuff, video game stuff. It should have waited a year to come out, probably. But you know, they added it. So whose fault was it? If Hello Games just needed to keep the game in the oven a little bit longer, why didn't they just do that? A lot of people point the finger at Sony because Sony is a big company. People often assign blame to the people with the most, quote unquote, power per se in the relationship when it comes to the gaming space. In the case of Hello Games and No Man's Sky, Sony paid for advertising, but No Man's Sky was entirely self-published and self-made from the devs. Everybody in that building made the decision to do what they did. I'm not speculating because Sean Murray himself said that publicly in 2017. In an article for Ars Technica, he stated the staff's networking team consisted of one guy managing a player count of 500,000 when he expected 14,000 as a highball estimate. Part of the reason, I imagine, was because, in Murray's words, Hello Games was running out of money. The staff had an average of 9 employees. That's not even enough to run a Five Guys, which may come as a shock to some of you. Hello Games definitely needed a lot more than Five Guys. Procedural generation wasn't exactly a new concept for games like this, let alone in the spaceship fly around genre with games like Elite Dangerous, but Hello Games was attempting something drastic here with a world-building core that was relatively small in game file size. Most of the game data, which was admittedly quite tiny at 2 gigabytes, was from audio and UI assets. Was it a gamble on Sean and Co.'s part? Did they knowingly take the hit with a bad release to get the initial cash influx they needed to finish the game? Did they, in essence, do a Kickstarter without calling it a Kickstarter? Sony wasn't able to take any of that flack for them. Sean Murray said right before the release, Sony has been super cool to work with, but mainly just because they haven't been involved in development, So this wasn't a case of Hello Games taking marching orders from an overbearing publishing boss, putting them under the gun to meet a holiday release. It's fair to say that Sean Murray and his friends at Hello Games 100% knew what they were doing and released a game in the state they did. Did they do it on purpose? I don't know. But it's fair to say that the primary reason they were able to sell such an insane amount of copies was because they promised a lot. Would they have gotten as much money if they had said, we have this cool idea, we just can't develop it yet? I don't know. I think the answer most people would say to that question is probably not. And who knows if Hello Games would have been able to make the game we're playing now. I guess the question is, was it worth it? For me, the story of No Man's Sky becomes one of an ethics conversation, more than a game development conversation. With the air of plausible deniability, Sean Murray and his friends were able to get away with a lot here. And to their credit, they did exactly what you should do if you release a game in an unfinished state on purpose without saying the quiet part out loud. If that is what they did, I'm not saying that's what they did. But rather than a Ponzi scheme, Hello Games and friends did indeed make an actual game over the course of a few years. It reviews well and has sold more than 10 million copies. Sean and his friends got their big break, and they're working on another game, Light No Fire, a high fantasy take, I imagine, on the No Man's Sky framework. I'm glad it worked out in the end. Both companies ended up taking the fall and had to pick themselves up. It was entirely on them. Nobody forced the executives at CD Projekt to release a half-baked game. And Sony didn't force Hello Games to do the same thing. This says a lot about game development in general. Getting your foot in this industry with a big break can be tremendously difficult. But as you can tell, in the case of Cyberpunk and No Man's Sky's massive popularity, the potential breakthrough payoff can be generational. What would you be willing to do to get there? A lot of companies, years later, have adopted this kind of practice to varying degrees. And that's why a lot of people to this day still haven't forgiven Hello Games or CD Projekt. Yeah, they eventually fixed the games after they came out, but the lack of transparency is off-putting to people. We should not pay to be playtesters. We should pay to have a finished product. This conversation's come up recently with Bungie's Marathon, a game that will be released for $40 with content that a lot of what people say feels half-baked and not ready to go to market. Nevertheless, Bungie and friends seem to be confident about the product that they have here, despite the relative lack of story content that the Marathon games are known for. I have no doubt in my mind that years from now, Marathon will be a rich, involved, classic Bungie experience. But right now, the game is not winning the vibes war for $40. Gamers talk about stuff like the cost of living and the increased cost of entry to even get into gaming these days, with more expensive consoles and more expensive games. Hello Games and CD Projekt Red were responsible for their own decisions, but in a sense, they were also symptoms of a greater financial problem in the gaming industry in general. It's not all black and white. They fix their games after release, but should things like that even happen in the first place? One thing is for certain, if you're gonna do this kind of build the airplane while it's in the air sort of game development approach, you better make sure you make a good airplane. It's the least you can do. And if you don't, you'll ruin your reputation in the gaming space for good. Just look at Peter Molyneux's Fable series. There's an important contrast to be made with CD Projekt and Cyberpunk. People get the idea that if a dev company self-publishes, that all of the decisions are made in a shared, equidistant power-sharing structure. At CD Projekt, management, the executive guys, made a deliberate effort to push the release forward. The devs may be umbrellaed under the dev umbrella and take the fall just the same, but they still end up taking marching orders from an executive who can be distant from the project itself. I think the stories of Hello Games and CD Projekt are fascinating because they can illustrate division of labor in the games industry and the self-imposed roadblocks different people in the development process can face. Approached the right way, even big companies like Larian can release a finished product and reap the rewards. No reputation screwery to be had. The greatest comeback in gaming may have happened twice, but for the sake of games, the people who make them, and gamers themselves, I hope it never happens again.